So now that you understand SFR and fatigue, I'm going to teach you exactly how to evaluate each individual exercise and its specific stimulus to fatigue ratio in its numeric value. This is a method that I learned from Dr. Mike Israetel, which I find extremely useful, and I'm sure you will too. So the first thing we are going to evaluate is the stimulus. And we're going to do this based upon 3 factors, each of which we are going to rate with a numerical value of between 0 and 3. 0 for nothing, and 3 for the greatest amount. So the first factor we're going to evaluate for an exercise is the mind-muscle connection. And so for this exercise, I'm going to use an exercise that I recently evaluated for myself, which is the stiff-legged deadlift. You see, last year around this time, I was doing traditional deadlift with progressive overload of weight, getting up to well over my body weight, but at that point I found that it had developed a very poor stimulus to fatigue ratio, which was poor because it was well over number 1. It was like 1.6, 1.66, or 1.67. And 1 being an ideal number, that basically means that it was 66% or 2/3 more than is ideal. So I switched out for the sumo deadlift, which had a much better stimulus to fatigue ratio, and I did as much progressive overload as I could do with that. Never had any issues there. And then I switched it for the stiff-legged deadlift. And that started causing me issues immediately. And I could tell right away that it had a much worse SFR than my original deadlift had. So I evaluated it. And I found that my mind-muscle connection was what I would rate a 2 on a scale of 0 to 3. And then the next factor you'd rate it on would be the pump effect, or the burn. And so that actually I got a 0 for. Some exercises aren't meant to give you the pump, but it wasn't giving me anything similar to a pump, anything like a pump. I wasn't feeling much stimulus. I was feeling a lot of fatigue, but not very much positive stimulus. All right. Then the third is muscle disruption. So that feeling afterwards that you have done work, whether it's soreness or whatever type of signals that your nervous system is sending to your brain, you would rate that muscle disruption from 0 to 3. And I was finding that, immediately after my workout, I got very little muscle disruption, just like a pump, but maybe a little bit more, so 1. So that leaves the stimulus at a numeric value of 3 total. Okay, you're going to add these all up. That gives you your numeric value for stimulus. All right, so let's keep that number in mind. Okay, we have a 3 for the stimulus, and then you need to evaluate the fatigue. So you're going to do that based on 3 factors again, also rated from 0 to 3, or nothing to the most. The first is joint and connective tissue disruption. So, feeling any sort of sensations in your joints and connective tissue, you would rate from 0 to 3. So I felt huge amounts of disruption to my joints and connective tissue, more than my muscle with this exercise, by far. So I give that a 3. All right, keep in mind that my muscle disruption was a 1. So this is a significant factor right there. That I'm feeling it more in my joints and connective tissue than my muscle itself, that this is a bad exercise. All right. Next, you're going to rate your rate of perceived exertion. Normally we rate this from 1 to 10. But now we're rating it basically, from 0 to 3. So if you had a 10 RP, if you're training to failure or beyond, that would be a 3. If you weren't really training that hard, like at a 5 or 6, that would be 0. My RPE for this was like about a 1, somewhere around there. I just, it didn't feel that hard to me, and not in a good way, okay? And yet it also produced bad feelings with my joint and connective tissue disruption. The next thing you are going to be rating it on is unused muscle strength fall off. So, fall down. This basically means how much weaker does it make you for the rest of the workout, even with exercises that weren't training the same target muscles. So this is basically an indicator of systemic fatigue. When it is systemically fatiguing you, you're going to notice that it is making you weaker for lifts that are working even opposing muscle groups. Okay, so you could be doing a pushing and pulling workout, and you start with bench press and go balls to the wall as hard as you possibly can, and then you go to do some rowing and you find that your hands feel weak even though they weren't pulling, they were pushing. Your shoulders feel weak even though they weren't doing the same movement pattern. You feel like you just can't row as much. You should be able to row much higher weight than you were pushing, but actually you're not. You're not doing as much weight as you ought to be. That is unused strength fall off. And this exercise, I did notice that it made me weaker for other exercises, like other leg exercises that were more focused on the quads and shouldn't have been affected by this, were getting affected. So I gave that a 2. All right. So here the fatigue is adding up to be a 6. All right. So with the fatigue at a 6 and the stimulus at a 3, that is double the fatigue than the stimulus. All right, giving you a SFR of 3 to 6, which then gets reduced down to a 1 to 2 SFR. All right, and so then what you do is you divide the stimulus number by the fatigue number. Okay, and so that then, in this case, leaves you with a 2, and that is the total number of your stimulus to fatigue ratio. And that actually is what I'm illustrating here in this graph, is a 2 SFR with a 1 to 2 stimulus to fatigue ratio.